I'm looking around, seeing how many of you I think were at the U.S. Bank Outlook last month, or a couple of other talks. Because I was actually, Mimi and I were talking on Friday. I have not had a long time to prepare for this one. So I took a whole bunch of slides from recent talks and put them in a box and shook it up. So I don't know what's going to happen. I do want interruption and discussion. I've tried to pick a few things that I think are going to be interesting to you. And towards the end, since I didn't have a whole lot of time, I've grabbed just a set of questions from one of the classes that I teach in health economics, which is a very different direction to go, but it could be fun. So, how long am I supposed to go?
You go as long as you need to. I know you need to cut out a little early.
I was assuming I had to do the requisite summary of an economic outlook, and so a lot of the numbers that were thrown around at the U.S. Bank Outlook, I'll point to them. GDP going up a little less this year, in 2013 than last year. The statistic I grabbed for you, and this is also on the Washington State Forecast Council's website. So Washington gets an economic outlook for the U.S. from Global Insights, modifies it slightly based on some of their work, and then builds the Washington forecast off that. So housing starts continuing strong. What I'm going to come back to, inflation. The forecast is for none, really at all. I'm also going to play with information on low employment growth continuing, a little stronger next year, but not much. So there's some arguments about how much that's going to tick up and what's going to happen to unemployment. So we'll play with those. Also of interest, I would think to you, the mortgage rates forecast are continued low rates. I hesitate to put this slide up in front of you guys because everybody, when I was walking, said, "Do you have good news?" Bob Schiller of the Case-Shiller Index, right? So built a series, and so this is his best guess. So take it with a grain of salt. Of real home prices adjusted for inflation since 1890. Trying to make some allowance for changes in house type, right? Because we don't all live in 4-bedroom, 1-bath, small houses anymore, and so on and so forth. Here's the problem. 2011 is the end of the black line. So he's looking at another 30% price drop to get back into a very long run price range. Doesn't feel right. So I welcome input from you guys, but when this comes up on campus and the economists all get around and say, well, housing still has some correction. So I put it up and I hesitate, but I thought, you're the folks that can tell me more about interpreting this graph. But I always found it stunning that we really talk so much about 2004 to 2006 as the boom years, but this is 2000, right? 2002. So early on in the last decade, things got out of balance compared to history. Yes?
What geographic area is that?
U.S.
Oh, that's why. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it has the influence of your Arizona, California, Florida, and so on. So I know this is not for Bellingham, but still a fun one.
Hart, do you have the same projection with somebody from Harvard?
It's a dig at Yale, because this isn't my projection. Bob Schiller's at Yale. So one more prerequisite before I change gears. There's a couple of slides that I put up at the beginning of most talks. And I have some other slides that we can build on this if we want. The whole fiscal cliff discussion, they could have gone better, to say the least. The discussion that's sort of missing is, this is a projection of the major components of GDP out through 2075. So we're right in here at the moment. But this is entitlements, Medicare, Social Security. Interest, especially if interest rates go back up, and then all else, education, defense, etc. Doesn't quite work, and so when you've got people saying, no, Social Security is off the table, we can't talk about it, or no, we can't raise taxes, they're both wrong. We may come back to that, but part of the reason I have a set of questions about healthcare later on and may get into that discussion is because of the need to address healthcare. Okay, so there's some discussion at the Business Pulse and a couple of other places about an ongoing series of articles, and we're going to start with this idea of 13 questions for 2013. So that's the 13 and 13. And they asked some of the folks at the business school, College of Business and Economics, what would be some good questions? Some fairly generic about the economy, some specific about individual companies or individual regulations. So I'm going to start and just play with a couple of these, and again, I invite interruption and discussion, because I don't want to just talk at you. So we'll jump in. What's the role of the Canadian dollar in the Whatcom County economy? So the milk piranha, most of you know, was when the Facebook pages and blogs came out about we need our own U.S.-only shopping hours at Costco and whatnot. There was a group in Canada that started making milk piranha T-shirts, and that's their logo. Take these numbers also with a big grain of salt. They called Costco, Walmart, Target, Fred Meyer, Hagen, and a whole bunch of stores and asked, how much of your revenue comes from Canadian shoppers? And Walmart actually kept us on the phone for quite a while, and they were great about it. They said, we tried to find out. We tried to do a fairly careful study and gave up, because you can imagine how hard it is. I don't know if you're Canadian, you're shopping with US dollars, or you're shopping with a debit card that you have on your US account, and so on. So the best we can do is, we've asked when you are checking out, what's your area code, or where are you from? And we've kept rough tallies, so the numbers are going to be rough. But still, when Walmart says 30% of revenues, or 30% of shoppers most days, and significantly more on other days, and Costco says we think about 50%. We do know that our store here has highest milk sales of any Costco in the US, and our gas station is in the top 5. That's pretty impressive. It'll get your attention. Target said they think 50% of all sales. Fred Meyer said 30 to 50 on pay-per-view, less than 30 on the Lakeway. The markets started to suggest something about the market store up in Birch Bay, saying very high.
The Trader Joe's, I asked them, and they said it's the 3rd highest per capita shopping per person spending of all the Trader Joe's.
Well, and a lot of these stores will say sales per capita in Bellingham don't make a whole lot of sense.
Right.
Because if you look at our population, if you look at our income, and so on. So we called the city, and they said the non-big box stores that we were really talking to here accounted for about 14% of local sales and use and B&O tax. And with all these stores saying nearly 50%, all these big box stores saying nearly 50%, if the big box stores are paying 14% of the total, Canadians are paying, what, 5 to 7% of that total? And that's a bigger impact than I expected, because we tried to do a similar study back in 2003. And yeah, border crossings were lower. We were still in the malaise of the 2001 closing the border, tight border. But also, I wasn't careful enough when I did that. I treated all retail stores the same. And that, in terms of who pays how much or shares of revenues, that was a mistake on my part. So a bigger impact than I had been telling people for a while. So I thought that was fun. Maybe I'm one of the few people that likes being wrong. Population growth, another topic that I thought was going to be potentially interesting to you. And one of the questions on that 13 and 13 is, population growth has slowed in Whatcom County, in a two-part, why and who cares? So this is population growth percent change, 1970 through 2011. Long-term average is a little over 2.2%, 2.3. Here's where we've been. Less than 1%, we're back up to about 1%. And I'm not trying to make a judgment call, this is good or bad, but I'm curious about it. Because if I've got a small business and I'm used to a certain amount of growth year to year, some of that growth is going to come from population growth. If the population growth slows, my revenue growth slows, and so on. Compared to King County. King County's long run average, they're now up around 1.7. Now that's King County, that's 1.7% on a base of over 1 million versus our 1% on a base of 200,000. So slowed appreciably. And part of where I want to go with this question is that economic activity differs across space. And there's some major trends that are intriguing in economics about what's going on in major metro areas and what's going on in rural areas, right? There is currently more population growth, more people moving to the big cities, and certain types of jobs found there that you're not finding in rural areas. So I guess part of my question is, are we urban or are we rural? This is a state graph, and I apologize, but here's Whatcom County. Just the third set. It goes U.S., for those in the back, U.S., Washington State, and then Whatcom, and this is Skagit Island and San Juan. The blue bar, population growth in the last 20 years. The red one, last 10 years. Yellow, next 10. Dark blue, next 20. And if I look at all the counties in our region, I see recovery in population growth, except in Whatcom County.
Why?
State's forecast is continually slowing population growth.
City council.
The big question is why?
And why? Who cares? That's where I'm headed.
City council.
Future-wise cares. Future-wise cares.
All right, we're not talking about future-wise or coal trains all morning. Just not going there. Not going to do it. Get that out of the way. I think part of the why is what types of jobs are we creating here, what types of jobs are happening or you're finding in cities like Seattle. So this is a large slice of the service sector, professional and business service jobs. And this is the job, change in jobs, Whatcom and King County. And things, we were all pretty close together, but coming out of the recession, it looks different. And the reason I have it as a question for 13 and 13 is I don't know the answer of going forward what's going to happen. To me, it's an interesting question to watch. I don't know if these lines stay apart or come back together. And I'm going to need at least another year or two to be able to talk about that with any confidence. But this is a fun one to me because you're seeing more professional business service jobs in big cities, not small cities. And that can matter for how we evolve. So coming out of the recession, so job growth since 2010, manufacturing, okay, strong in both. A little bit of resurgence in manufacturing in the U.S., and that's a fun story by itself. Our construction sector has always been larger than the construction sector in Seattle, so that one doesn't surprise me a whole lot. This one is what caught my attention. Significantly different growth rates in professional business services, a little bit different in retail. And this is what's driving, I think, the state's population forecast. So these are their forecasts of employment growth in some of these major sectors. And I really want to focus on these out here. So 2010 to 2015, they think we're going to have a little bit slower growth in professional business services than Seattle. What you're seeing here, this part of the healthy growth in information is a logos story. A lot of growth from them and a couple of smaller companies. Look what they're thinking is happening once that peaks out. 2015 to 2020, almost no growth in information, still slower on the professional and business service. So they're thinking if these types of jobs, and this is what's driving some of the migration, aren't happening as much here. Now, Skagit, Snohomish, Island, part of the reason they get a little bit of an uptick in the out years in their population growth rate is commuting into Seattle. It's not sort of resident jobs. So that was I think watching what types of jobs we get here is going to be important. So are we moving towards more rural or more urban? And I think that invites a couple of questions. I'm going to stray. Are we having a slow recovery? Every time I ask that, somebody says, are we having a recovery yet? But is the recovery slow? Is it just a slower recovery here and we'll catch up? Is that a reasonable story to tell? Or is there, in terms of the evolution of our economy, is there something structurally different now? So let me play with that just a teeny bit. And I think in a big picture, that's a really important question. Because if the blue line is sort of our trend line, or not really average, it's defined as our potential GDP. And you typically, the economy cycles around, sometimes above, sometimes below, sometimes above, sometimes below its potential or its long-run trend. And with this particular recession and financial crisis in 2008-9, our real GDP diverged, obviously very noticeably from the potential. And you got to ask, is it cyclical and we'll come back to it? Or should we just pull this line down, disconnect it, pull it down? Is it a structural shift? If you think it's cyclical, you'll embrace a certain type of policy. If you think it's structural, you'll embrace a different type of policy. So from a policy perspective, that's an important question. And I want to try to ask it a little bit more locally, not nationally. Yes?
Is there any trend during recovery or even during recession of migration to larger cities?
Not that's really evident, because every recession is typically different in terms of which industries get hit. Right? The recession, the dot-com recession that hit some of the tourism industries also had, the dot-com bubble and the terrorist attacks in the recession of 2001 had a particular flavor to it. We didn't get hit very hard at all. Some of the big cities did. You actually saw some movement out of major metro into small metro locations. So it changes by depending on which sectors are getting hit in the recovery. This recession hit all sectors.
How does this picture have to do with the Gordon paper about the change in the growth rates? That the big industrial revolution was the big driver of productivity and economic growth, and that we're probably entering a phase of much lower economic growth, that the newer technologies are not drivers of big economic growth.
You're getting 2 or 3 slides ahead. So I'm going to come back to that. So it's a great question. It's because I'll hint at, are we in a phase of slower growth along with this shift? I mean, so does it now go like this, at a flatter trajectory? And I've got a slide to talk, a couple slides to talk specifically to the productivity question. I think that's an important one. So the question about, is it a slow recovery, and this is still national, not local, but this is a website for nerds. You can go to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and play with your favorite recessions. You can click on any recession you want, or any set of recessions, and compare them. I picked the last 4, just to look at them. And a couple of you have heard me talk before. I've used this slide, and I won't belabor the point. It struck me as interesting that it goes 1981, 1990, 2001, 2007. They go in order, chronological order. First time I asked my students, what do you notice about that? Somebody said, well, we have a recession every decade, which I hadn't even. But the recoveries are longer in sequence. Don't know whether that's because, again, a structural question. Did we bounce back from recoveries faster when we had a more resource-based economy and we're slower in a more service-oriented economy? Do we come out of them slower because we try to do more to soften the impacts? So on and so forth. Good fun questions. The black diamonds are the official end dates of the recessions, and I'm just going to line them up. The recovery coming out of this recession, the red line, is no slower than the recovery in the last 2 recessions. The rate of growth is the same. The problem is deep. What's also gotten people's attention, and this is the employment side. Part of what's getting people's attention is the disconnect between economic activity, so I've got GDP, and jobs. When GDP got back to its pre-recession levels, we were doing it with 6.5 million fewer workers. Right, so this gets to your productivity question in part. Because that's definitely a productivity story. We were making as much with, it was actually almost 7 million fewer workers, and we still aren't back. So the job market's not back, part of the economy is, and that makes a sort of a hard story to talk about. Now, if I can weave together the productivity questions or the issues about productivity, job type, are we getting these, what kind of jobs are we getting here? And this is really what you were getting at. The cover of the Economist magazine, the most recent issue, talked about the humble loo. And that there really hasn't been an invention so wonderful as the humble loo ever since. At least not one that changes society, and that we're possibly entering into a period of low innovation, low productivity growth, and that we should plan accordingly for lower growth. But a little bit ironically, a couple of years ago, the cover story was titled "Print Me a Stradivarius." 3D printers, and they actually printed this violin and played it. So it's innovation comes in fits and starts, and then the effects of innovation on the economy are often fairly hard to predict. With 3D printers, there's going to be some interesting change in how we manufacture things. It stands business plans on their head. Because if I'm in the manufacturing business, I can now make one of whatever it is. And I can say, do you like it? Help me. Then I can change it a little bit. I don't have to manufacture a bunch. It changes the risk model altogether. It changes the investment model altogether. So I don't know. I don't know that we're in a period of low productivity. And when I put this with what is supposedly happening in the energy sector, the U.S. being possibly an energy exporter in 2020, with the lowest cost energy economy in the globe. So to me, it's an outstanding question. It's a huge question to watch. I can't predict. I'm more optimistic about innovation and productivity gains going forward. But I'm going to come back to my driving question. Be careful, because who benefits and where the winners are, so to speak, it's not even. It's not even by job type, and it's not even in geography. So the red line, very loosely speaking, skill or occupation, if you will. Think education for a moment on the horizontal axis. Vertical axis, think employability. And everybody's been told more skill, more training, you're more likely to get employed until you go to grad school in economics. But that's, and you'd expect something like that red line. Sort of just a steadily upward sloping line, right? That the more skill I get, the more employable I am. And that red line is from 1980 to 1990. Somebody has to explain the blue line to me. That's 1990 to 2005. Low skill, change in employment was positive. Notice this line is 0. More skill, less employable, and there's even a range where there was job loss. More skill, harder to get a job. And then back in a range of more skill, easier to get a job. Okay, I couldn't remember if I put this slide in here or not. So these were some academic papers, and what they were saying was low skill, non-routine jobs, executive assistants, sales reps, and so on, there's job growth. High skill, non-routine jobs. Here's job growth. Lawyers, engineers. Medium skill, routine jobs. And for the productivity story that we were already saying, how many paralegals does it take? Well, I don't care. How many paralegals does it take today to do what 3 paralegals did 15 years ago?
Half.
Go from 3 to half, and there's your story, right? And finally, the Federal Reserve is, and this came out of the New York Fed, picking up on the same thing. So they've got in this one, it's high skill, upper middle, lower middle, and then low skill. There's just not been much job growth. So this is job growth from 1980 through 2010. Not been much job growth in the mid-skill categories because of productivity gains. It's not an outsourcing story. It's completely a productivity story. What kind of jobs do we have in Bellingham? This sort of closes my question about if the high-skilled jobs are going to the major metro areas, if we're growing mid-skilled jobs, hey, it's still fine. I'm not trying to make a huge judgment call. I'm just saying, if you want me to make a forecast on our population growth, our wage growth, and so on, I've got to get my hands around, well, what kind of jobs are we growing? And we'll come back to that in just a moment. So fun set of questions, and it's something that I really want to watch. Next question I had on that list was, we're going to have inflation? We can take a vote, I guess.
I met with Rick Larson last week, and he actually said that there's an interest in Congress in redefining what inflation is, or by changing the definition of the consumer price index to change the basket to more accurately, he says, reflect.
They periodically, so the consumer price index is one measure of inflation, and it measures a basket of about 300 goods. And it looks at how does the price of that basket, that if you were to buy those items continually over time, how has the cost of that basket changed? And so if you're able to substitute out of that basket for something that's not in it, or if there are relationships between income, they have to constantly adjust that, or not, they periodically update that basket. And there are some arguments over whether we're measuring inflation properly. But one of the key debates that's going on right now is with quantitative easing 1 through 3 and all sorts of efforts by central banks. The monetary base, the money supply in the U.S. has gone up rather noticeably since the recession. The old rule is an increase in money supply has to be inflationary. More money, more transactions, or more money, things are worth less relatively speaking, prices have to go up, so on and so forth. And within the Federal Reserve, the debate is you cannot have inflation with house prices, so within labor markets and so on, as stagnant as they are. Somebody else saying, well, we can have inflation from a monetary perspective. So the debate is, can this really drive inflation, or what else is needed? And the punchline from the Fed, so the graphic I just had and the notes I have here come from Federal Reserve president's speeches. And it's a bit of a sleight of hand, but they say, look, as long as the Federal Reserve, the yellow area, it's money going into the system, yes, but most of it is sitting and being held as bank reserves. And as long as the Federal Reserve is paying sufficient interest on those reserves, the banks should be willing to just sit on them, which means the money is not circulating more and more through the economy, not inflationary. Therefore, no real risk of inflation. That's not truth. That's just the dominant view in the Fed right now. Question for you, though. When the recovery starts, or when we fail to reach agreement on debt ceiling and we default or whatever and interest rates go up, the question then is, can the Fed control the resulting inflation? And if you are an optimist, you say that the Fed will be able to see it coming a little bit and unwind things. And yeah, we'll have a little inflation, some would be helpful. I'm not too worried. If you're the pessimist, you say, no federal central bank has ever been able to predict the future with that kind of accuracy and create a soft landing. And so, pretty healthy debate. I put it under my questions to watch because I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen, but it's an important question for sure. All right, I'll do this one very quickly. Part of my job, the question I had in the list was, if you were in charge of economic development funding, what would you fund? What would you do? Part of my job at the Center for Economic and Business Research is to make academic research relevant or useful to either government or business. And one of the things that we've been playing with is trying to analyze job creation strategies, and I'm not trying to be very political here. I'll phrase this as a question to you. To keep my job, I have to publish a paper periodically. I have to do publishable research, right? And a couple of us that are working on this research can't decide if it's meaningful enough, important enough, So bear with me. Everybody's heard small businesses are the backbone of the U.S. economy. Small businesses create more jobs. Everybody's talked, you've heard about clusters. You know, that Seattle's trying to get a biotech cluster in South Lake Union area, whatever. We've had efforts here on an economic gardening program where you're supposed to support existing sort of mid-sized companies called second stage. They're out of that first startup phase. They're not old and mature, they're in that second stage. All these things that sound great. What's the data say? We got data on every firm in the state of Washington from 2004 to 2010, and actually can break it down by establishment. So you don't want to attribute job growth to just a movement of employees within a firm. Right? You don't want to say that, well, this establishment opened here, you've got to make sure a similar establishment didn't close elsewhere. So trying to keep track of that. And what we were asking was, how much of the job growth can we explain by the firm's age, its size, what sector it's in, where in the state it is, the urban, and I'm back to my urban-rural questions, high wage, low wage, and a number of other factors. So lots of statistical analysis, lots of gnashing of teeth, and a few trips to the bar, to be honest, because we don't know. I can give you any result you want. If you want me to give you a study that says small businesses create most jobs, I can do that. You want a study that says older businesses create more jobs, I can help. And so on and so forth. All I've got to do is tweak a little bit how I measure job growth. Right? Percentage change in job growth will necessarily favor small companies. If I measure job growth in the absolute number of workers added, I'm going to favor large companies. I can account for size in different ways in my statistical analysis. The effects aren't linear, right? So I can model the nonlinearities differently, and so on and so forth. In other words, if you can find an advocate to give you a paper to give you whatever result you want. There's no economic theory that says here's exactly how you measure job growth. What bugs me is that no one in the economics realm is telling practitioners and people in the public sector, oh, by the way, my model only explains about 10% of the job growth. I'm all excited to tell you that firm age is statistically significant in my model. Isn't that great? I leave out that I'm really not explaining very much of the job growth at all. I can't publish this in an economic journal because I'm not doing any new economics. Is it worth taking the time to try to get this out into a policy journal? I don't know. For me, the concern on an applied research basis is that we spend lots of money. We have state regulations. Olympia tells Northwest Workforce Council, you will concentrate your efforts in these clusters or these sectors. And the state is saying to the Economic Development Council, you will fund these programs. And I'm sitting back here saying, we've been researching this for 2 years and can't find any reason that you should be doing that. A little bit disconcerting. And my question to you is that something that sounds like people at Western should pursue or set aside?
Well, I'm thinking, what's the amount of public money going into these types of things?
Lots.
Like, do we ballpark figure?
Hundreds of thousands a year. Across the state is much more than that.
What percentage?
Because I mean, that's kind of the question I have, and I've been having a local discussion with my city council in Ferndale is, you know, if you can't show a public benefit from it with any certainty, I don't pay taxes so you can gamble.
Well, it is picking winners.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to say don't do anything in economic development. There's a whole heck of a lot you can do in infrastructure, education, and some other areas. But there comes a point when you don't want to start trying to pick winners at a granular level. All right, major shift coming because I didn't have time to prepare a whole lot. So huge change. Every time I ask somebody, because we have a lot of fun in a health economics class, so we get to chew on some of these things with some background reading all quarter. And every time I ask somebody, you know, I'm going to go talk to the Realtors or to Rotary, and I think I want to do healthcare. And they just say, you're stupid. Why would you get into a topic that's so divisive or so emotional and so complex? You can't do it in a typical 20-minute talk. You can't even do it in a 40-minute talk. So I'm doomed to failure. Here I go. There's an article. It's a fun article. It's about a year old that we now use in our class, and that's the title of the article. Is the U.S. healthcare system uniquely inefficient? And I put system in quotes because it's not designed as a system. Trivia. Why do we have health care benefits provided by the employer? That's an artifact that's unique to the United States. Why did that happen?
Came out of World War II to attract workers.
So World War II is correct. Wage freezes. The wage freezes that were enacted coming out of World War II, businesses could not compete over wages. I couldn't increase your wage to attract you. I could offer you better benefits. And there was an interesting discussion about whether or not it should be company-specific or industry-based. The Auto Workers Union had a really interesting argument in favor of making benefits industry-wide. So if I moved from Ford to GM, I kept my benefits. GM and Ford had an interesting argument saying, why can't I distinguish myself from my competitor? Both made sense. Ironically, what the labor unions were arguing for would have made us look just like Germany, where benefits are aligned by guild, right? Similar industry sector. The companies won. It was a logical argument. Here we go. That's why I put in system in quotes, because it's just this collection of odd rules and happenstance. So are we uniquely inefficient? And I'm not going to spend more than about 10 minutes on these questions. We could spend all day. I got to vote for yes. I see some other nods. Who wants to help me with an argument for no?
Depends on the definition.
Well, why do you have to run 50 tests if you already know what the guy's got or the woman's got? That's the inefficiency of our system.
Well,
is we are trying to cover our
right, quick tangent on that. We set up a panel for class. We had Gary Goldfogle, county medical examiner, and had a couple of other physicians. And so Gary just hops up and said, "Fine." He turns to the person in the panel who wasn't an ER doc and said, "I present at your emergency room," and he described himself. "I have chest pain, I have this kind of blood pressure, I'm on these medications. What will you do to be 75% sure I'm not having a heart attack? And what will it cost?" And it wasn't much at all, and it cost next to nothing. And he said, what if I need to be 90% sure? Okay. We're up in the $50,000 range. What if I want to be 98% sure? Right. To your point exactly, what level of risk should patients and or physicians accept? And that's a tough one. The article went on to say, if you want to define healthcare, and so this is, how do you define it, right? If you want to define healthcare's goal as being equitable and even access, and your focus is on public health metrics, life expectancy, infant mortality, so on, then we are inefficient. If, on the other hand, you put an emphasis on access to specialty care, and you take into consideration our obesity, our lifestyle, our diabetes rates, and so on, any other system in the world that had to treat a population like us and provide some of the things that we demand, we're not inefficient at all. So it was a good reminder, and buried in that article and some others, so the infant mortality question. What's a viable birth? How would you measure infant mortality? So we don't rank very high in infant mortality if you've seen the charts. And one of the arguments against the U.S. healthcare system is we pay so much, and so much more than anybody else, and our public health statistics don't look very good. Lots of reasons. We define a viable birth differently than some countries. A lot of countries will say, if the baby doesn't survive the first 24 hours, it wasn't a viable birth. So how you measure all of these different statistics weighs in and matters as well. If I get angry and emotional about this one, my wife's a physician, and she's been trapped in electronic medical records hell for about 6 months. She doesn't like it when I say it's a necessary transition, we've got to go through it. It's easy for me to say, because I get to just watch. But I'm seeing some really interesting things as I watch a bunch of physicians and I read the literature. This article in the New York Times on Friday that said, maybe we overstated the benefits. And in 2005, the Rand Corporation did a study that talked about how many billions of dollars we could save in U.S. healthcare if we switched to electronic medical records. And because that way your primary care physician can talk to your ophthalmologist, or they can see what each other were doing, and so on and so forth. And that study was very instrumental in getting the federal government to promote the adoption of electronic medical records. And this past fall was the end of your opportunity to get a government subsidy if you met meaningful use standards of electronic medical records systems in your practice. You got X dollars. Hospitals had to do it first. Private clinics are now underway. And absolutely fascinating to watch physicians. Here's your incentive. You're a physician out there. You've now got to put my history into electronic medical records, into an electronic system, into a database. And when I come in, what comes up on your screen is, it's going to vary. It depends on what software I've purchased. But there's a template that pops up. And to try to save you some time, that template will auto-populate